The classical period in world history runs from about 1000 BCE, 1000 or 800, to 500 or possibly 600 CE. Little fuzziness around the edges, but that's the time period. In other words, it's about 1.5 millennia long. We will be spending several sessions on the classical period, which may surprise you since we've raced through over 2.5 million years of human history in 3 sessions thus far. This lecture is meant to introduce some of the basic characteristics of the classical period, some of the key issues, and then we'll have an opportunity to expand on some issues of detail in subsequent sessions. Not surprisingly, the classical period is a really crucial world history period, and the basic point is some of the key formative elements of major civilizations, some of what historians call the great traditions, were forged in the classical period, and they would be ingredients in world history from this point onward, and that's one of the things we'll try to amplify today. The classical civilizations focused in areas where river valley civilizations had flourished earlier, but there was usually some relocation involved and always an expansion. A key center was China, but now in the classical period, China expanded from north along the Yellow River to the southern portion as well, forming the Middle Kingdom that has remained a fairly coherent core in Chinese history from that point to the present day. Indian civilization would now spread through the whole subcontinent, and its focus would be in the Ganges River basin rather than in the northwest. Classical Mediterranean civilization would utilize some of the heritage of Egypt and Mesopotamia, but obviously would locate particularly in Greece and the shoreline of the eastern Mediterranean, and ultimately spread westward both in North Africa and in southern Europe. The classical civilization that stayed closest to its river valley roots was Persia, which also had its center initially in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, but would spread more widely in the Middle East as a whole. The classical period is easily described in terms of the separate stories of these 4 major civilizations: China, India, Persia, and the Mediterranean. And we'll do a little of that today. But the main purpose of this first lecture is to highlight some of the issues the classical period has in common among all 4 civilizations, so that we don't lose the world history forest for the trees. A secondary purpose, though I'm not trying to beat people over the head with this, is to make it clear that as opposed to the Western civilization tradition, which obviously would linger lovingly on Greece and Rome, the world history focus embraces Greece and Rome as one of the truly important classical traditions, but gives at least equal attention to other major cases. Usual caveat becoming, I'm sure, quite familiar. It's important to remember that the classical world was not yet the whole world. The classical civilizations would radiate influence to other societies. India was actually particularly influential, with trade and cultural contacts with Southeast Asia and to some extent the Middle East. China would radiate influence into Korea and Vietnam to a certain degree. Greece and Rome would radiate influence into parts of Africa outside the empires proper, and obviously into Northern Europe. But the classical civilizations themselves were only part of the whole world, and some societies that would be important later on were essentially untouched by classical developments per se. At the same time, these classical civilizations, although they all utilized river valley achievements, they were all larger than the river valleys. Indeed, that's one of the main points of this emphasis on some coherent features, the expansion of major civilizations. And without question, they commanded the largest population concentrations. At its height, the classical Chinese Empire embraced about 54 million people. Classical Rome, at its height, about the same amount of territory, by the way, had about 52 million people. We're less sure about the population of classical India. These were big units in terms of population, dwarfing population levels in other parts of the world. The individual stories become an important part of the classical period, and I want to evoke them briefly, and we'll come back to elements of these in subsequent lectures. During the classical period, China, for example, went from the fairly decentralized, often landlord-dominated Zhou dynasty, which was a long dynasty but not particularly politically coherent, to a major period of centralization under the Xi dynasty, and then the maturation of centralized political and ideological operations under the Great Han Dynasty at the end of the classical period. In other words, there's a story within Chinese civilization, and when we emphasize the ultimate durable features of classical China, we're sort of summing up and frankly oversimplifying this story. What I'm calling the classical Mediterranean, and this is familiar stuff, of course, what I'm calling the classical Mediterranean started with classical Greece, remembering that Greece was not only concentrated on the peninsula, but also had city-states in other parts of the Eastern Mediterranean, and ultimately other places as well. Starts with Greece and emphasizes the Greek tradition to its decline in the 4th century. Then the classical Mediterranean would go through the period of Alexander the Great's conquests and the ensuing Hellenistic period, in which Greek cultural and political influences interacted with traditions of Egypt and the Middle East, including Persia. And then in the final phase, emphasis shifts to Rome, the Republican period, and then ultimately the Empire, which became the most coherent geographic expression of the classical Mediterranean as a whole. Many people accustomed to a more Western-focused history would be happy with more detailed treatment of Greece and Hellenism and Rome as separate entities, and of course they weren't the same thing. But remember, China also in this same period was undergoing important shifts from Zhou to Han, and I'm not sure the Mediterranean experience is necessarily more complicated. We're just accustomed to dealing with it in a somewhat different fashion. Persia represents a somewhat interesting challenge. In its heyday, in the 6th and 5th centuries BCE, Persia was far more important than Greece, and something of a Persian tradition was established with a strong, effective government. The Persian government of this time introduced the first postal system in world history. It organized a series of travelers' inns that facilitated trade and travel throughout the Middle East. It was a successful conqueror, spreading throughout the Middle East, challenging Egypt, obviously ultimately challenging Greece, though unsuccessfully. But the Persian tradition is slightly different because ultimately the Persian tradition would be partially overshadowed first by the conquests of Alexander, but then more importantly by the conquests of Arab Islam. So there is a classical Persia. There is a Persian tradition which crops up recurrently in world history, and obviously today there is something of a reassertion of this tradition in the present-day state of Iran, with its growing claims to regional and global political and cultural attention. But the Persian tradition is handled a little differently in world history, and I think we're only getting used to the notion that we need to pay more attention to it than we did heretofore. Classical India involves the story of the in-migration of Aryan or Indo-European peoples, long a herding people. Their culture, which they brought in from Indo-European roots with elaborate religious stories, which gradually get codified into major works of literature and religious philosophy. Gradually, India, in this second civilization period, settled down into more recognizably coherent development with a major empire in the 4th century BCE, the Mauryan Empire, and at the end of the classical period, another major imperial statement, the Gupta Empire. Separate stories.